So hi everyone, I'm Emma Maslen, I'm the CEO of inspir'em, and welcome to this webinar on decision process. I'll just knock my laptop. Today we're going to be talking about final stage objection handling, and in a moment I'll introduce Indie Blackwell from Hellios to talk to us about that subject. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Indie. So Indie, welcome to the webinar today. Really excited to have you. I know the team are very excited to have you on the webinar today as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emma, for having me. Should quickly introduce myself then.
That would be great. Yeah, thanks.
Brilliant. Okay, so Indie Blackwell, I've had way too many years in revenue and commercial leadership as well, so about 20 years as well in different organisations. Currently, I'm heading up the commercial organisation at Hellios. So for those of you who don't know, Hellios deal with supplier data management, mainly serving the financial services industry and also the defence industry as well. So key things we do, obviously supply data management, but through a very unique community and sector specific approach. So I've been around for about 10 years, and I've been brought in just over a year ago now to kind of scale up our team and expand our operations into different regions. So it's an exciting time for us. Yeah, and hearing lots of different objections that actually I've come across in the past. So this is going to be a fun webinar.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we recently had a session on this with the team as well. So, and it's interesting that how a lot across lots of different organizations, lots of the same things come up. So we'll talk about that today. Again, just to further, just to talk about Helios for a second. So many of you, and I know that we've certainly talked about this in other company sessions as well, see Helios at the very final stages of a sales process. So if you are dealing with financial services organizations, defense organizations in primary markets, then you may well have seen Helios come up. And that might be part of the final negotiation that you're trying to navigate, and certainly things that can delay some of the processes at the end. So we'll talk about that as well. So quick question then, Indy. So you mentioned that you've seen lots of these sort of final final stage objections, and they tend to be the same across different organizations. So what are some of the things that you typically see? What are the things that often we forget that customers are going to ask us for or surprise us with at the end of a sales cycle?
If I start with the obvious ones, right? Price is normally one, right, that you come up against at the end. It's always like, oh, don't have the budget for this, or don't have it quite yet. They want to negotiate. It could be payment terms as part of that as well. So time as well is potentially also a blocker. So, this now's not the right time. We've got other priorities that have come up. So it's been deprioritized for whatever reason. I think another one that generally surprises people is when the legal team come in, right?
Yep.
And you have objections that come through from the legal organization. And then with financial services organizations, defense, that's generally right where you kind of end up and have to navigate and slows down that sales process as well. And I think then another key bit is sometimes stakeholder management. Well, we need this department involved as well, right? So we've been speaking to procurement. We now need to go and speak to the cyber team, right, as well, or a different risk domain as well in the sector that we deal in. So that comes up quite frequently and can either slow you down and make you go back, as you said, to understanding the pains, the medic, kind of the metrics piece as well, but also key thing being, utilizing your champion well to make sure you understand which other stakeholders need to be involved from the organization. They're the key ones, but the surprise one generally is legal or a new team coming in that you haven't spoken to.
Yeah. Yeah. And we have some views on this, just because we're going to be talking about mutual success plans in the next session that we're doing. Our experience tells us that we know that legal and, other stakeholders will be involved. And it is interesting that sometimes we don't try and address the elephant in the room. So, what's your view there just on that? Because, your experience would say that, of course, legal are going to get involved. Of course, there are going to be other stakeholders involved. Why do you think that that becomes a surprise to our teams when that happens?
I think a lot of people don't consider how long that can take in a big enterprise organization,
Mhm.
right? They think it'll be easy, but generally, when we're going through a process and we're going through a legal process, we might not fit in to their kind of view of if you're a SaaS platform and you also offer services where you fit. So there will be conversations needed. So I suppose the tips that I would normally say is when you are at that point of negotiating, you also start negotiating on the T's and C's as well.
Mm.
You send those out, you understand it. And I think, Emma, when you came in to deal with the team, you do something called a page turn review. So you don't go back and forth with red lines, right? That's a good trick and a good tip I would give to everyone is start that process as early as possible.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So for those of you who aren't aware of what a page turn is, so rather than you having the back and forth with legal, it's you allocate some time with the legal team, with your legal team, and you go through the terms and conditions in one go. So it avoids having the back and forth, so the delays between teams not being available to review those red lines. But it also means that you get decisions there and then. And also, one of the things that I've always found with annoying with legal as well is sometimes people send back the wrong versions. So you feel like you've negotiated something and actually you end up with the wrong version. So that can be a real challenge. So yeah, and stakeholders as well. So if we're operating in this, the idea of something like MEDDPICC is you're operating in the same way for each of your sales. If, you will know the stakeholders that will be involved. So often it's a case of almost having a checklist of who should be involved and going back to those stakeholders. But what about price then, Indy? Because, that's something that we hear about quite a lot, and I know that we've done a lot of work on that as well.
Yeah.
What are your tips on price and how to navigate that?
Yeah. Well, look, I'd say to anyone, if my team are listening, we're dealing with procurement. It's their job to negotiate on price, right? It's what they're trained to do. So we need to be ready for that as well. And I think a lot of that then comes back to, I think I've read your blog as well. And it's a really good word to use, re-anchoring the
Yep.
value as well. So going back to the kind of ROI, the business case, like how much value this, if you've done understanding of their pains well, you should be able to replay that at that point where price doesn't become an issue. But sometimes there is, right? They might be in the middle of their budget year. They don't have budget for it as well. So there is a kind of quid pro quo, that you can play on. So if they're delaying the decision, they want some sort of a discount. You ask them for something, which is kind of like, let's put some urgency into this deal, and you might give them something back, right, in terms of a discount of some sort. Don't like to go there. Always start with the value piece because generally, if you've done that well, it should be an easy obstacle and objection to overcome.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's probably a few things in there's worth sort of reiterating. So, re-anchor value first of all. Procurement are generally not involved in what the value of the solution is because that's not part of their remit necessarily. They're just adding
Yeah.
the numbers of the costs into the business case. Understands though that procurement will ask for something, and we're going to talk in a second about champions and about how you can use that. But your champions will know what procurement are going to ask for, so make sure you keep something back. But just to your point about discounts, and again, we see this quite a lot in organizations, is often we offer discounts as incentives to get a deal done, but often we offer them at the point when the deal isn't ready to be done. So what ends up
Yeah.
happening is the discount gets offered and the customer is not in a position to actually deliver on their side of the bargain, which is get something done by the end of the quarter. So we have to be really careful with discounts because a lot of people experience we offer a discount and then you have to give the discount anyway, even though time has passed. So
Yeah, I think that's the worst thing, isn't it? When you've said it and then they're like, oh, actually, decision maker's gone away, and you're like, can we hold the discount, right? And then they
yeah,
hold it, and then it slips a month, and then all of a sudden the urgency's gone, right? And you're waiting 2 or 3 months,
yeah,
and it's no longer that kind of anchoring point or kind
yeah.
of compelling event, right, that you're hoping for, which was the discount goes out the window. So you end up doing yourself a disservice.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's just hugely devaluing solution for sure. Okay. So tips and tricks on getting champions and economic buyers involved. So, we've talked about some of these objections. Where do you see, champions really playing a part in helping navigate some of these objections?
Oh, they play a huge part. If you've got the right champion that's able to get to your economic buyer as well, that's signing this off, you should have, hopefully, one of the tips that I do is work on the business case, right? Make sure they really understand the ROI, whatever you're presenting back, that they understand how to relay that back internally and will champion the case, right? They can talk about it financially, they
Mhm.
can talk about it in terms of the value it's going to bring, so time efficiency. For us, it's supplier onboarding time as well,
Yep.
how that's going to reduce their time to do those tasks so they can then focus on value add, creating more value for the organization. So get them on your side
Yep.
quickly and then utilize them or mobilize them, right? Especially if you come up against that objection.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, mobilizing them, yeah, that's a really great word. And I know that that's very much a challenger word, actually. And often we use that in trying to distinguish between people who are coaches and champions. Champions are mobilizers, coaches are talkers. So if you sort of think about that in your mind, at the end of a sales cycle, most of the conversation that's going to need to go on to get something done is not going to involve you. You need somebody that's going to make that case for change, for sure. Yeah. So what about some stories around maybe further qualification? So maybe you've had some objections that have come up at the end of the sales cycle, and actually that's led you into you thought you were maybe there at the end of a sales cycle, but actually something's happened and you've realized that maybe you aren't as far along as you thought you were. Is any particular things that come to mind around stories from your past?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the actually, it's a renewal, right? So coming up, if you talk about not a new business sale, but a renewal that was about to happen at a very, very big defense organization, right? So we won't name which one, but we thought, been working with the same stakeholder group. We thought we had everything done, and it was actually with the head of strategy as
Mhm.
well at the time. So we thought we had everything signed and sealed. They've been renewing. They'd have, straight renewals for the past 4 or 5 years. What we didn't realize at the time, so we got to the end, same person had signed it off, and
Mhm.
they were like, "Oh, got a new boss," right? And you're like, "Oh, you do you?" Right? So all of a sudden you're back going, "Okay," and they don't see how this is of value, right? So it came back to not understanding, and what we had to do, it took the renewal back by about 3 months,
Okay.
which was, so it was a big, big pause. But, so we had to go back to, and it was a big learning actually as well. So big, big learning in that didn't understand the decision-making process, right, as
Yep.
well, and new stakeholder that we hadn't engaged with as well. But also there wasn't a mutual account plan in place that
Okay.
had been agreed with that new individual. There was one, but it hadn't been agreed. And this is where actually we hadn't used the champion enough to understand it. We'd just kind of assumed that it would happen because it was a straight renewal for like 5, 6 years
Yeah.
as well. So just understanding things change in organizations. So we always need to know who are kind of like the stakeholder map, what it looks like, but also the power and influence of the people that we're speaking to.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, loads of lessons that are in there for sure. I mean, we see this a lot, first of all, around existing customers and not going back to, okay, so what's going on in their world at the moment? And that could be organizationally, somebody new coming in, like you mentioned, or it could be actually that just the world is changing at such a pace these days that something has happened, particularly with some things that are going on in the US right now. The landscape's changing quite a lot, which is affecting a lot of things all over the world. Um, but interestingly about the people, because we do see that a lot where there is an assumption that your champion has been the champion always, so therefore they'll be
Yeah.
your champion again. We don't stop to think, well, actually, what's changed in their world? Who's new? So, and that's something that we can easily teach for, right? Because there is a easy way to have a checkbox there. And then you mentioned a really interesting point as well around the mutual action plan. Just making sure that that is a mutual plan and that you have gone through that with them, and it's not just something for hygiene's sake. So, um, just you said that was a big learning. How did you then have that conversation sort of with the team to make sure that that is then something that isn't repeated again in the future? What were some of the things that you did as a leader to sort of help reinforce those learning points?
Yeah, I think in our key account mapping and plans as
Hmm.
well, just to make sure we really understand the organization, like
Yeah,
who's new, who we need to be. Because, although we then got in touch with this other individual that came on board, there were two others, right, that then became our champions as well. So kind of walking the halls and
yeah,
having a kind of quarterly checkpoint with the team so they understand who they're talking to, how we're engaging with them, what is their power and influence in that organization as
yeah,
well, right? So making sure that we didn't just leave it to one team or certain individuals, that we had a really broad reach
yeah.
across an organization.
Yeah. And I think that's another great point in there around what happens often when we're in sort of operating and with our customer success teams. We tend to, when we do a sale, we tend to deal with people quite senior because they're change makers. When we get into run, we tend to drop down a level. And then from an adoption perspective, we're dealing with people who aren't in a situation where they can often be power, have the power and influence. So then that's quite difficult if you don't have those quarterly check-ins, like you say, to then be able to get yourself back up again. And, it's a lot harder to do that. So trying to get RCS teams to maintain those senior relationships so that then they can go and have those conversations. They're all really great points. Okay. Any tips and tricks that you have around sort of those final stages? And if anybody does have a question for Indie, please feel free to put them in the chat and I'll monitor the chat as well. But what are your tips? What are the things that you've always gone back to, Indie, just to drive that repeatability in the forecast?
Yeah, I always make sure that we understand the pains, right? So at that point, replay,
Hmm.
your understanding of the whole medic process as well. But most importantly, that you have put together a business plan or an ROI. So because that generally comes up, we don't see the value of this at the moment. You've created also kind of an anchoring time for them, but why should they sign by the end of that's the biggest thing. Why should they sign by the end of the quarter? Where
Hmm.
maybe this is kind of it's not we're not replacing anything. We're actually coming in with something very new. So it's a bit of a challenger sale, right, in that sense
Yeah,
as well. So I think I always make sure that we've understood that and that we've got not only verbal from the champion, right, as well, but we have spoken to the EB as well.
yeah,
And then before I forecast it, and they have given us time commitment. So I play back that mutual kind
yeah,
of the mutual kind of replaying of timelines, accountability to get the deal done.
yeah. Yeah, and it's worth saying, just particularly for the sale that you're trying to do at Helios, it is one of the more difficult sales because, like you mentioned, often there isn't something that's in place. It's very much a productivity play. And actually, it's a productivity play on the customer side, but also on the vendor side as well, which also makes it very difficult for the customer to realize some of those productivity gains because often it's their suppliers that are seeing the productivity output as well. So, like you say, the business case is going to be very important, but it's a very risk-based business case as well. So making sure you've got that senior alignment is absolutely going to be key. And I think that's a great tip as well for leaders around, we often talk about the difference between great leaders and desk leaders. It's important for you to understand that you've been and met with the economic buyer and understood that decision process as part of that validation. That's a really great way to look at it because you're dealing with, these are big ticket items in enterprise. We absolutely need to be talking to those senior stakeholders.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And so another question just on sort of dealing with procurement, because it's probably worth us just diving into that for a second, because, they're your primary personas that you're dealing with. So procurement and third party risk, which I think most salespeople's idea of hell, I would think, was dealing
Yeah,
with
they're
procurement.
fun.
I mean, it would be interesting to get your view on that persona as well around Paul Huggett would love me saying that actually, because
Yeah,
obviously with his background as well.
he's probably on the line. He's going to ask the most difficult question in a
Yeah, quite
moment.
possibly. Um, but let's just talk about that persona about procurement for a second. Are there nuances with dealing with procurement that, you find that if you're dealing with people on the business side of things and things are a bit different, do you see that there's a difference there in that persona?
Um, Yeah, a little bit, because sometimes you are replacing something that they have been doing, right, themselves, right? So there's a little bit of a threat element as well
Yeah.
in there as well but so I think one of the things that you have to really focus on is that value creation piece,
Hmm.
right? Exactly. So making them feel like there's a big gain for them here in terms of, if Helios come in, we're going to be doing your supply data management, which means kind of reducing the admin time, which gives you time back to work
Yeah.
on the more strategic value added things within your organization, right, which actually benefit the organization as a whole. And we take on that part of the work. So seeing us as additive to their role as
Mm.
opposed to kind of taking something away.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And your typical economic buyer is that chief procurement officer, CFO, they're your
Yeah.
economic buyers? Yeah.
Yes, they
Okay.
are. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're
Sorry, gone.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I was going to say, and one of the big things that we also come up against is a lot of them are digitizing, or looking for new digital transformation kind
Yeah.
of journeys that they're putting their teams through. So generally, it's kind of like, well, where do we come in the pecking order as well? So that can delay the deal sometimes as well, and that means working really closely with some of our partners, like we work with PwC, we work with others, working with the platforms as well.
Yeah.
So there's an API integration that needs to take place. We understand that, and the client understands we come in earlier, right, as well, because we start cleaning up the data, so they've got a really nice data feed going into that platform.
Yeah. Okay. And I think just worth just a final note, just on for the sellers that are listening to this. So, and I can imagine that, you've got a regular enterprise seller that's trying to sell into a Lloyd's bank in the UK, and then all of a sudden they realize that they're going to be asked to operate through Helios because that's, part of Lloyd's process, for example. Do you have any tips for sellers that are trying to sell into financial services and defense organizations to get ahead of the requirements for them to become Helios members?
Mm. For them to become Helios members.
Just to sort of get ahead of the game a little bit, for it not to be a surprise, because we do see that a little bit where deals are held up because all of a sudden they're told by procurement, well, you need to go and work with Helios, and they're like, oh, who is Helios? How do we operate with that? Any tips there?
Yeah, I think one of the things we are working on are those kind of partnerships and alliances as well. So come and speak to us, right, as well, because generally we plug into an ecosystem as
Mm,
well, which is centered around an enterprise platform of some sort,
yeah,
right? That a lot of the banks, the defense companies are going for. So actually working together and understanding where we work in the workflow is best. I
yeah.
think as well. We're seeing a lot more of that, a lot more organizations coming to us to work directly with us.
Yeah, absolutely. So a great tip there. I think just as people are working through their mutual action plans, their close plans, making sure that you understand um the flow of how deals move through procurement, understanding the systems that are involved there. So if you then do have a surprise, if there is an opportunity to go and work with, a Helios, that you see that early. And certainly, we do encourage that on from a paper process perspective anyway, that you're going through all the approvals and all of the systems so you understand that in advance. So that's great. Okay. Amazing. Well, that's been really great, Indy. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really, really useful. And I always find it fascinating that your primary customers are procurement as well. Like I say, they're special, special
Love them.
individuals
Yeah.
for sure. Amazing. So, just one final word for me. So, the next webinar that we're doing in 2 weeks, we've actually got Eric Webb, who is Global Head of Pre-Sales for SAP Concur, joining us. He's going to be talking about mutual success plans and the need to get ahead of services and ahead of technical requirements for mutual success plans. So, really excited to see Eric's going to be joining us in a couple of weeks. So, well, thanks very much, Indy. It's been great to see you, and thanks for joining us today, and everybody that's been on.